And it was quite clear to Mark that they were very aware of their self in the mirror. And the reason here, he speculates, is at least that this is an extraordinarily biologically salient marker. It's not just some red dot on its forehead, which give a damn about. It's this biologically salient marker which could affect its social status, its social prowess, reproductive fitness, all sorts of things. So the test is flawed, plainly, it seems to me. So I'd be interested in seeing when they can find out a test that defines what a self is.
One thing I alluded to yesterday is the idea of kin recognition mechanisms. What are the things that we respond to in people? How do we distinguish between kin in different categories, and especially within categories? And I'm particularly interested in this with respect to individuals who are adopted and then reunited later in life, and what triggers go on between these people to perhaps lead them to engage in a great deal of cooperation, strong social affiliation, as compared to people to whom they're unrelated and yet have been raised all their lives.
I want to make a comment about not necessarily what I think the greatest problems to be solved might be, because as John and Roger pointed out, it depends on where you're coming from and what you do. What I'd like to have clarified is make it clearer to people in this room and to certain people who represent the press, like Roger Bingham in some cases, that the name of the game or this entire development that's going on in Darwinian thinking is not reducible to just Darwinian psychology. In all due fairness to people like Ed Wilson and Richard D. Alexander, these are not psychologists. They are exploring Darwinian questions from a biological point of view and not necessarily involving the study of the mind. I'm a Darwinian anthropologist. I'm not a psychologist. So not everything done in the name of Darwinism or neo-Darwinism these days is Darwinian psychology. And unfortunately, the more I see the press handle this, the more the whole field is beginning to be identified with just one thing that one group of them does. And Don Simons, in fact, himself pointed out that what he does is just part of a larger enterprise that involves lots of different scientists who have different interests and are attacking different problems, but using basically the same general set of theoretical ideas, Darwinism.
Okay. All right, let's get our next question.
Addressed to both of this morning's speakers, I'd like to know whether in your efforts to derive an objective or reality-based morality, either of you have run across either of the following writers, and what your reaction was to them. If you rejected their approaches, can you be specific as to why? And the two writers are Ayn Rand, who also attempted to derive an objective morality, and George H. Smith, author of Atheism, the Case Against God, who wrote a couple of articles in the 70s about the difference between a rule-based morality and a standard-based morality. Rule-based being thou shalt, standard-based being if you want A, then you do B.
Michael, you want to hit that high hard one out of the park on Ayn Rand?
Yeah. You'll see over there, volume 2, number 2 of Skeptic, the one with what I call the Gort Pieta on the cover, Pat's beautiful painting of the robot and the Jesus. Anyway, in there I wrote an article called I think it was the most unusual cult in history, and that's the Ayn Rand objectivist movement, where Rand attempted to ground ethics in some form of pure rational, absolute, right and wrong principles that can be derived through pure reason. She called herself an Aristotelian and started with this sort of logic, and she ended up, well, actually, Bernard, if you could grab me one of those, the Pieta one, I'll read you this phenomenal thing. She actually became the final arbiter of right and wrong of all action, like, you know, what movies you go to, things like that. Would be an indication. Yeah, let me just flip that real quick there. It's the one with the little picture of the horse here. This is from Nathaniel Brandon, her longtime student and lover. This is what they were taught to believe about Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand is the greatest human being who has ever lived. I'm quoting from Brandon, her best friend, lover, etc. Atlas Shrugged is the greatest human achievement in the history of the world. Ayn Rand, by virtue of her philosophical genius, is the supreme arbiter in any issue pertaining to what is rational, moral, or appropriate to man's life on earth. Once one is equated with Ayn Rand and or her work, the measure of one's virtue is intrinsically tied to the position one takes regarding her and or it. No one can be a good objectivist who does not admire what Ayn Rand admires and condemn what Ayn Rand condemns. No one can be a fully consistent individualist who disagrees with Ayn Rand on any fundamental issue. Since Ayn Rand has designated Nathaniel Branden as her intellectual heir and has repeatedly proclaimed him to be an ideal exponent of her philosophy, he is to be accorded only marginally less reverence than Ayn Rand herself. But he concludes it is best not to say most of these things explicitly. One must maintain that one arrives at one's belief solely by reason. Now, I'm something of an admirer of Rand. I think she's a genius. I had some great ideas and a strong woman. I like some of her characters. However, that's a perfect example of what happens when you try to ground ethics in some absolute system where you've got the final answers. It creates heretics and true believers and no one in between.
I have to confess mostly ignorance. So I picked up a copy of Atlas Shrugged once 5 or 6 years ago because people who had listened to me talk about things were always saying, "Have you read Ayn Rand?" As if I should, and I think there was some positive connotation there. I couldn't get past 3 or 4 pages. I just can't stand that stuff. And I'm largely illiterate when it comes to literature. Well, I don't know. You start with these stories about these people. Well, never mind. I just don't care about them. You know, if I don't care about somebody, I don't care what happens to them. I'm not going to sit and spend my time on it. The Smith book, The Case Against Atheism. Boy, I've got that right there on my bookshelf. I spent a little time with that too, but like most things books that I spend time with, it just. Which doesn't mean it's not a good book. That's just my intolerance. I couldn't get into it enough to have it engage me. So.
Question here.
For Nancy Siegel, yesterday you seemed to say 2 things. One, that on MZ twins...
To talk about twins, I had to say 2 things.
That's true. Well, this might add up to 4 things then. On MZ twins, that it apparently, the basis of their IQ seemed to be about 70%. And secondly, when they were raised separately, the environmental difference was very little, maybe only 20%, 30%. Now, based on that, what is your opinion of the argument in the bell curve that the majority of the cause of racial differences in IQ tests is genetic?
Well, first of all, let me see if I can clarify the data that I was presenting yesterday. The reared-apart twin data yields an intra-class correlation of 0.7, and because these are MZ twins raised in separate uncorrelated environments, this gives us a pure or direct estimate of genetic influence, which is about 70%. What that means is that the variation or the differences among people in a population are associated with genetic differences between them. It doesn't mean that if you take a single individual that you can dissect their IQ into 70% genes and 30% environment. So it's a population concept we're talking about, and it's something that's not fixed or carved in stone. It's population dependent, it's test dependent, it's a lot of things. But nevertheless, the results were quite robust across the studies. Now, I also pointed out that identical twins raised apart are somewhat less alike than identical twins raised together, a difference of 0.7 versus about 0.86, so that if you're raised together, you're a little bit more alike. So the common environment has somewhat of an effect. If you look at IQ studies based on adoptees and biological intact families, you get a somewhat lower estimate of genetic effects. So people tend to quote a range of about 0.5 to 0.7. Now, you're asking me to put my life on the line here for the bell curve. I believe that individual differences in intellectual ability are genetically influenced. That's not to say that genes are the whole story. And when I say individual differences, I'm talking now within populations and not between.